chapter 2, 3, and 4 go into the details of the different practices and agendas that were put to the fore in order to overcome the old status quo. Everyone, not just the Gramsci and the revolutionary shop stewards in Britain, who were following, in a way, much of ideas of Lenin, were asking for a new world. It was actually the elite itself. So if you read what someone like Lloyd George was writing on the Times, or anyone who was actually in the state bureaucracy, it was the time for home fit for heroes, for a new world, all this war sacrifice. Now people should get something in return. So from measures that were going to be about distributing resources, so the whole reconstructionist trend of the bureaucracy, all the way to the Workers' Council movement in Italy, led by Antonio Gramsci and Palmiro Togliatti. So I look at a whole spectrum of possibilities, from the more reformist to the most radical. And it's very fascinating to see how in the Workers' Council movements, for example, and in Italy, they had a big impact to the point that everyone in the summer of 1920, in which for a whole month, the factories in the whole country, in the whole peninsula, and including, by the way, the countryside in which peasants were occupying land, the factories were being run by the workers. They emblematically sat at the desk of Agnelli in the Fiat factory, and they were running the show. And these workers' movement in Italy had as direct inspirers not just, of course, the original idea of the Soviets in Russia, but also what was going on in Britain with the revolutionary shop stewards, in which war was declared both against the capitalist state and against the capitalist market. The idea here was that you could only achieve political democracy if you really achieved economic democracy, which meant that there needed to be self-governance in the production process, and thus the abolition of wage labor substituted with the idea of the council, which was fundamentally an understanding of direct democratic assemblies that would decide on the production process. And from there, the idea that this would be the nucleus of a new state, a state that was not alienated from the people, but was of the people for the people. So I don't want to get into too much detail. I go through, of course, L'Ordine Nuovo was a newspaper, and this was the big thing at the time, was that this changes in action, these new practices required new ways of thinking. So the concept of praxis that Gramsci comes up with and lucidly theorizes in his prison notebooks was, of course, the outcome of his actual militancy during the 1919-1920 years of the factory councils. And the point of praxis was that you could not act differently if you didn't think differently, and how thought and action mutually reinforced one another. So that L'Ordine Nuovo was also a journal in which not just intellectuals, but workers and intellectuals were working hand in hand, would actually think about novel ways of understanding the economy and new economic theories that put at the center the worker, rather than, of course, what we see today with the neoclassical framework that was, of course, emerging at the time in reaction to these theories that were actually empowering for the people. Austerity, I would like to say, is more than just policy. It's also the theory justifying the policy. And of course, this theory was a theory that came out in direct opposition to a theory that was instead trying to empower the worker. So while the L'Ordine Nuovo movement was putting at the center stage the worker as producer, saying there should not be any classes, we should all be producers, the abolition of class hierarchies for a common understanding of all men and women as producers, to a model that instead expels the worker and puts the entrepreneur at the head of the economic framework and says the worker is nothing but ultimately a passive add-on that depends on the virtuous capacity to save and invest of those who can abstain. And that is the neoclassical framework that was coined at the time, and that is still dominant today. And it's what students learn when they go to school, though they learn it in a way that takes the impersonal form of the textbook. So they forget about the origins of this very theoretical framework that once more was embedded in a certain historical moment, which was a historical moment of clear class struggle. So in this, I would like to end by saying that it's very interesting to see how a theoretical framework that explicitly expels class struggle from its model. So if you look at the neoclassical framework, the foundations of micro and macro that students learn, there are no classes in the models. There are only fundamentally agents, individual agents, and the outcome is harmonious. And it's interesting to see how this harmony amongst individuals was thought about in a moment in which there was clear conflict amongst classes. So the expulsion of class struggle and conflict and exploitation from the economic theory was clearly a very political choice in order to make it such that people would consent once more to an order that presupposes, in fact, class conflict and exploitation in order to even function. Part of the effort of this book is to again show how the world we live in is shaped clearly by some economic policies that have as their main objective that of shifting resources from the majority to the minority. And this is austerity in its threefold form that I just described. But these policies would not be active and shaping our daily lives if they weren't backed and justified by specific economic theory. And that's why for me, austerity is more than fiscal austerity. It's fiscal, monetary, industrial, and it's also more than just policy. It's policy and theory that go hand in order to preserve consensus for a system that often shakes, often is in crisis. And once more, I think that we are today experiencing quite a big crisis of it. Of course, not as revolutionary, but yet something is happening nonetheless. It's enough to think about all the unionization efforts that are taking place in unknown spheres of our economy in the United States. The whole Amazon, Starbucks, all the service sector. This is unusual, and it's something that frightens the establishment. And even if they portray austerity as an apolitical necessity in order to fix inflation, it is very clear that, of course, you need to fix inflation, but the reason why you need to fix inflation is because inflation expands the discontent for a system that clearly is not delivering in satisfying the majority. And if this majority escalates its dissatisfaction, then there's a problem. There's a political problem that requires fixing. That's why austerity is portrayed as a necessity and one that is only technical, and that's why we should leave it to the experts of the Fed and other independent institutions, while in fact they know themselves that it's the most political action of all, backed by theory that pretends to be non-political, but it's the most political. It's a very powerful weapon in order to subjugate the majority to accept what's going on.